Welcome to Gaulcast. Sorry, it's been a while, but we are here with my new co-host, our good friend Reno. How's it going, bud?
Hey, very good. Good to see you. Good to hear you. Things in the general world have been moving very, very quickly. Things in Gaulish polytheism have been moving just as quickly in some cases, and in other cases very slowly. A lot of the different major communities have had shifts in leadership. There's been a lot of people coming new into the community, a lot of people leaving, a lot more talk about it. Uh, yeah, so time
Absolutely.
flies.
Yeah, and I've been kind of in and out of it, like we were talking before I hit record. Was it, it I am in so many different Discord servers that I get overwhelmed really easily with all the activity. But I do try to check in, and yeah, it just seems like every time I dip in there, there's something new going on, and yeah, the shift in leadership was definitely a new one. Um, but yeah, definitely a lot of neat stuff, and yeah, just yeah, personal life. I'm a apprentice in a sheet metal union, so I'm traveling a lot for work. So trying to find time to do this is very tricky, especially trying to balance life.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Mm.
It may have been a while since people have listened to an episode, so maybe you want to do introductions fresh over and just kind of update people on where you're at and what you're doing.
Sure, yeah. Well, I am still Arakados Terranignos, and yeah, I started this podcast a couple years ago. It's still weird to think that it's been a couple years now. My first co-host was Brenna Gara, and they have, you know, decided to. I think they are doing a different podcast and got some life ventures going on of their own. So yeah, I tried to do this solo for a little bit, and it was just a shit show because trying to trying to put myself in a schedule while trying to balance, career and kids was a lot trickier than I imagined. Uh, but yeah, starting this out it was something that a lot of people in the community had talked about doing, and I was always on board to help out and do what I could, and it just always seemed to fall through, and finally I just kind of stepped up to the plate, like I guess I'll just do it, and yeah, it's been a sporadic episode since, but people seem to really appreciate the podcast, and I'm really hoping to keep it going. And yeah, with you being on here as my co-host, bud, I don't it'll be a great improvement because you're a very knowledgeable individual. You've been a guest for like I think two or three times now, so it
Yeah,
only made sense.
three, I think, three. Yeah,
Yeah,
or two, something like that. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, the good news is I have a lot of free time on my hands. I've been a stay-at-home dad for the last 2 years, which may have been probably right after my last appearance. I'm not quite sure, but it's been a hot second. So I'm a stay-at-home dad right now. I got some kids. They're going to school. Um, yeah, my name is Renataros Takogenos, and I am a Gaulish polytheist, uh, but I'm not so super firm about a lot of labels. Recently, I've been undertaking my own Finfaring journey, which is something that Rune Rasmussen of the Nordic Animism podcast and channel talks a lot about.
Hmm.
And I have been studying with a lot of teachers from existing polytheist traditions, trying to bring in that kind of stuff into my practice and also other practices, and just for general education purposes, to create more of that like sticky stuff that helps things go from a personal belief system to a modality, a lifestyle, and I think a lot of it is that we tend to view, especially here in the West, um, we tend to view belief system as this is what I believe, this is personal. Whereas in a lot of the rest of the world, religion is less a belief and it is a lot more a skill set. Is this is what I do. I do Gaulish polytheism. I engage with this, but not less, but a lot less. Oh, in Gaulish polytheism we do. It's no, I am doing Gaulish polytheism. And so I've studied with Mongolian shamans, Siberian shamans, and just recently um, I've done some very heavy work in Vajrayana Buddhism, specifically the
Hmm.
Sakya school, and a lot of Swiss folk religion, folk magic. That's a whole nother bag. So just
Yeah,
studying all of these disparate and very alive animist and sometimes polytheist traditions has been really, really interesting. So yeah, that's what
absolutely.
I've been up to.
Yeah. Well, to kind of talk on a little bit more, because like I've been more active on TikTok because it's just really easy. Because I was trying to do the YouTube thing through Gaulcast, and I am planning on getting some more videos out because those are fun to do. It's just editing is what takes forever. But so I've been doing like some shorter stuff on TikTok to kind of get some education and some knowledge out that way. Um, and it has been a lot of fun. I do get kind of caught up in a lot of the other stuff, because there's definitely a presence of like white supremacists and all kinds of bigotry and stuff in and out of paganism, of polytheism, and it's something I definitely try to take a firm stance against. So I do kind of get distracted from posting Gaulish stuff on there, but. Um, but speaking of, you were talking about going into Swiss folk traditions. I just got a book. I'm going to start reading it here soon. It's out of my car, but it's called Mountain Magic, and it's about alpine. Someone I forget the author's name, but it's about alpine magical practices, and I am so psyched to sit down and finally read it.
Well, that sounds really interesting. I haven't heard of it yet, but
Yeah,
I'd love to get my hands on it and compare
yeah.
notes. That seems really cool.
Let me see if I can just quickly look at Mountain Magic. I'll look it up later. There's too many things that are popping up when I type that
Yeah, I'm
in.
sure. A lot of ski resorts, I imagine.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
But so today's topic, we are going to kind of go into the into the Hallstatt culture, which is one of the earliest culture of the Gauls and other proto-Celtic cultures. In history, and I believe I'm not going to jump into it right away, but I believe it starts at the tail end of the Bronze Age and actually leads into the Iron Age before it eventually turns into Latin. But anyway, you did
Yep.
some more research on the origins of it, so why don't we just let you kind of kick it off here, bud?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So with this being kind of a resumption from a hiatus, we figured that this is a good place to start. And the good place to start is 4 years into a podcast, and we're going to start
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning, the Bronze Age. Um, and by the Bronze Age, I mean a very nebulously defined time period. The Bronze Age wasn't the same all over Europe, all over the world, even, and they've happened at various different instances. So, what we're talking about specifically today are the cultures that are going to lead up to what is typically thought of as the Celtic Bronze Age, which would be the Latin period and Hallstatt period, and see how those are connected as well. And so we're going to be leading up to those and talking about it. If you're at all interested in a lot of the polytheistic traditions of Europe, you'll have heard phrases like bell beakers and corded ware people, and a lot of these ancient people, ancient societies, are the way that we largely think of them as by their name, which is just material culture. So,
Wow.
a lot of researchers find a lot of battle axes, And then a culture becomes known as the battle axe culture.
Oh yeah.
Those guys that made the battle axes. What's important to note is that this doesn't account for a lot of the day to day. It doesn't talk about a lot of the um, ins and outs and a lot of the minutia of the spirituality of the people of those times or their lifestyles. And a lot of these cultures span a couple hundred years, and we don't know exactly what developments there were. But what we can safely say is probably one of the most famous uh, Bronze Ages was the early corded ware. And this, we're talking now about 3000 BCE. And this is the corded ware culture. The reason they're called the corded ware culture is because they were really into pottery. They made some great pottery, um, and they would use corded um, twine or jute or whatever organic textiles, and they would cord them and they would press this into the ceramic jugs, vases, plates that they made, leaving a very distinctive pattern, and that's where they get their name from. And at this point, it's important to note that we're not 100% as to who these people were. Um, Oftentimes, they get conflated with the hypothetical idea of Proto Indo Europeans. A lot of people love to throw about Proto Indo European as if there's some sort of defined singular culture or singular language. It's important to note that this is a hypothetical language model more than it's a people model, but it is useful in seeing as far back as the cultures were connected, kind of a common ancestor, but purely hypothetical, because there's no attestation of the language at any of this point. But the corded ware culture begins in what is sometimes called the Copper Age, where we see a few copper tools, copper hand axes come up, but not a lot of metallurgy. We do know that at that point, people were already weaving, they were already making intricate textiles, but fur was also still used, fur skirts, leg wraps. We have a couple instances of socks and shoes. So we know by then people were wearing stuff. They were living in villages and tribal groups. And the corded ware culture goes on for about 650 years. And during that time, we actually experience, or it is currently thought, that we get the first breakaway from the ancestors um, of most of Europe, of a lot of Europe, and that is that we have a break off that becomes the bell beaker and then the battle axe culture, which I mentioned earlier. And this is oftentimes synonymous with a lot of lay people with the ancestors of the Germanic people, but it's important to note that it's not that simple. It just means that at that point, the language and the material culture shifted to the point where the corded ware people and the bellbeaker people could no longer be considered a singular like entity. The languages were probably at that point still mutually intelligible, but they were different. And we can assume that other aspects of their society were probably also the same, but also different. A lot like, if you live in Colorado or you live in Utah, that's both are mountainous regions, both are very, very similar, settled a little bit differently, different social climates. And so, still mutually intelligible. Or yeah, and so then what happens is we get into the Eunestis culture. And the Eunestis culture is a direct evolution of the corded ware culture, and it is actually a cousin to the Nordic Bronze Age, which is then the evolution from the bell beaker and the battle axe culture. And those are existing kind of side by side. Scandinavia enters the Bronze Age a little later than um, Central Europe. But the Eunestis culture goes from about 2300 BCE to about 1600 BCE. So that is 700 years. And this is where we start getting some of those first really famous, really iconic Bronze Age pieces of art. Um, a big one being the Nebra sky disk that we know of, that big sky disk that was found in Germany, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And there's currently a bit of a debate for the exact dating of that item, but the traditional view is that it comes from the Eunestus culture. And this is also where we get those hand poured bronze swords and bronze daggers, the ones that are in like a singular mold and they look like big wedges and they have all those knobs on them. And a lot of the material culture is still ceramic. And what crops up again is something that is very, very common for this time period, pretty much all over Central Asia, India, and Europe, and that is burial mounds. Those become incredibly popular. And what's really interesting is that these burial mounds are very, very similar to what we see in the Nordic Bronze Age and going forward up until the Iron Age, is that you have people being buried in tombs and then earth being put on top of the tombs. And the Eunestus culture, again, we don't know too much, but what we do start to see is very intricate personal adornments. We start to see jewelry playing a big part. And that jewelry is made of bronze, it's made of copper, sometimes some sort of primitive alloys. And we see a lot of twisting in that and a lot of decorating with like stipples and ridges and zigzags. Um, the language of this culture is probably an ancestor of both Proto-Italic and Proto-Celtic, meaning that Celtic, Italic, the Phrygian, uh, the Scythian languages, all of those were probably still, they didn't exist yet. There was one language at that time that would later become all of these. And which brings us then to a bit more of a famous example, and that's the tumulus culture. And a tumulus is one of those mentioned burial mounds. It's just a specific style. And these are actually, in a lot of ways, the precursors to the very famous hill forts that the Gauls used, the oppidums. And those were later on used by Romans and Germanic people that moved into formerly Gaulish areas as well. And the tumulus culture is actually known for a very, very interesting thing. It used to be during that World War II era, and there were some very unsavory German nationalist ideas about Germanic people. And a lot of stuff that was made by the tumulus culture is actually accredited to ancient Germanic people, when we know the majority of the ancestors of what would become Germanic people were currently up in Scandinavia. They weren't near the tumulus culture, although Scandinavia did experience a lot of influx of trade goods, and there was some style mimicry happening. So, these people still talked, they still traded, they knew of each other. But the tumulus culture is actually where we get those brilliant golden conical hats. They're incredibly heavy, very, very fragile, but they're almost like brimmed Abe Lincoln hats, and they're set up in tiers. And they have all these dots and zigzags and lines. And what the current theory is, mostly speculation, is that this is where we really encounter that Bronze era of solar worship. In the Nordic Bronze Age, you get all those twisty horns that they have, and you start to get some of those rock carvings, again, with very heavy solar motifs. And that's where the stereotype arises, and along with the fact that a lot of other Bronze Age societies were big into solar imagery. So the idea that solar worship was all the rage comes from there. Truth be told, we don't know too much. We're just uh, going off of what little we have.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but again, indicators that this is the ancestor of what would later be known as the Celts is that they have a very particular methodology for constructing barricades, which is this is called the Murus Gallicus, which just translates to Gaulish wall, and which was later on be known in the Gallo-Roman area. But it involves a bunch of bricks being stacked, leaving specific holes for beams to be placed in, and then the beams can be used to build floors or steps. And yeah, there was also a very, very famous find from this time period, which shows just how much they relied on bronze and how intricate metalwork had become. The people at this time period were dipping their feet into agriculture. They were hunting, but they were starting to rear their own animals. And this piece is known as the Bronze Hands of Perales. And it was actually found in Switzerland, in Mittelland, so right between the Rhine and the Alps. and it is assumed to be a prosthetic bronze hand. And we are
Hmm.
talking about something that is, dated over 1,600 years BCE, that before the fall of Troy. And they were having, presumably, prosthetics. This was a bronze hand that was kind of curved on the underside. So it was convex on the underside, or concave on the underside, convex on the upper side, with a curve like structure. And it was found in a grave along with other bronze adornments. And so the tumulus culture kind of gives way to the first big culture we're going to talk about, and that's the Urnfield culture. And the Urnfield culture is called that because there's this sudden and very dramatic change in burial practices. While previously, in both the tumulus and the preceding Eunestus culture, it was all about the burial mounds. In the Urnfield culture, people started burning their dead. Well, people were burned and placed sometimes in very simple ceramic, but sometimes in very ornate bronze urns. And these were buried in fields, specific locations, rows and rows and rows. And we see a lot of this. So, what we know for sure is that this indicates some sort of change in either the culture, pressure to bury dead quicker, or maybe a cleanliness, or perhaps a socio-economic, maybe a cost to benefit thing. Um, Maybe it was also just a fashion, or it could have been a change in religious idea. We sadly don't know for sure, but something very drastically changed for them to start burying their people differently than they did 1,000 years ago. And yeah, and in the Urnfield culture, again, we have those very, very intricate conical hats, only now they're getting larger. They're getting like very, very long. And those are the very big ones that were used for a lot of very unsavory identity politics back in World War II. So during the previous era, there were conical hats, but now they're getting even longer. We're talking Doug Dimmadale of the Dimmadale Dome style big. They were all about that. And we also start seeing sets of bronze armor crop up. Previously, armor had been poorly attested, but now we're getting breastplates. We're getting full on helmets with cheek flaps. We are getting leg protectors. We are getting huge, huge discs that are worn maybe ornamentally, maybe as part of a lighter armor. Um, but we have tons of different and very, very highly deviating examples, and the solar motifs just start to go crazy. We get all sorts of wheels, mostly four spoked, sometimes eight spoked, and they're oftentimes in solar configurations. And we start seeing this other thing, um, which is called a bird headed ship. We start seeing a very similar to, if you've ever seen those Norse petroglyphs of the ships. We see that very similar, some curved ships, but they end on both sides with bird heads, or heads that resemble birds. Because again,
Yeah.
we don't know what they were called. We just know some dude or some lady or some non-binary individual looked at them and said, "Hey, these are bird heads." But they're very, very common. They appear on funerary urns, they appear on armor designs. And yeah, and this is where we start to see some of the first oppidums, like proper. The walls, the fences, the palisades, the layer of wood in front of the layer of stone. And yeah, what's important about the Urnfield culture, though, is to realize it's not a singular group of people. I alluded to this earlier, that there was one language that would become many languages. And in some way, that resembles how there was a people that would become many people. And at this point, the Urnfield culture has already started doing that. It's divided into a bunch of very small um, groups, some larger, some smaller, and some very regionalized. And it's thought that here is where a lot of the proto languages start to develop. Um, you have proto Phrygian, Proto-Thracian, Proto-Celtic, Proto-Italic. This is when they start to differentiate, but they're still doing very similar things to one another. And we also see that from Scandinavia, people are moving back down slowly, slowly. And now Jutland, or what is now known as Denmark, is not so much within the sphere of cultural influence of Urnfield, um, but now is part of the Nordic Bronze Age. So you see people migrating down a little bit, but the general idea is spreading outwards. And yeah, this the Urnfield culture very much dissolves into the Hallstatt culture. Many of these cultures you have to think of like they're flowing from one to the next. And that's especially the case with the Urnfield. But the Urnfield is also turning into a bunch of other cultures. It's kind of dissolving and it starts turning into Hallstatt. It kind of happens side by side. You have the Urnfield culture for about 100 years, and then slowly parts of the Urnfield culture change into what we recognize now as the Hallstatt period. And there's also this problem that there's a very strange phenomena that happens with carbon dating between the years 750 and 450 BCE. The carbon looks a lot the same. So they have a lot of trouble dating organic matter. So it's a little bit nebulous for us. But during the transition from Urnfield to Hallstatt, a lot of things come up that we can now start to identify with the idea of or Celticness or Celticism. We won't truly see a material culture that is analogous. So a culture that we can confidently say this is the Gauls, these are the Gauls, this was them, until we reach Latin period. But when we start to go into the Hallstatt period, we're definitely seeing the direct step right above. It's important to note that there were, Italic people, Proto Phrygian, and even some more Southern Germanic people groups that were participating in this culture, that were trading, that were imitating the style, or even still part of the cultural sphere. Um, but yeah, exactly. Here we have those daggers with the horns, um, very, very similar to the later man shaped daggers, with the four limbs and the heads. So, but they have horns or they have big old discs. They become almost convoluted to wield, but they're very ornamental. And this is also where we start getting a bunch of cow imagery. Cow and bull imagery just explodes. And there's a lot of research recently that's been going into this that says that we have Mycenaean Greece and the Minoan cultural sphere of influence actually extends all the way up. And so the ideas of bull worship and something else called a moon boat, which is like a half moon that's set up like that. Those become spread all throughout continental Europe. And we see here too in that transitionary period between Urnfield and Hallstatt that we see these moon boats. And they are oftentimes made out of ceramic and they are propped up. Sometimes we find them a lot in clusters, which means that they were probably deposited there, maybe as offerings, maybe as part of a ritual. But we do also find them in domestic situations. So they were perhaps the earliest form of of altar pieces. We don't know too much about what domestic religion or cult looked like before that because we didn't leave a lot of images um, or idols or that kind of things. But these are the first tangible objects that may be linked to cultic behavior. A lot of the bulls, which of course invokes imagery of Tarvos, the Gaulish bull god, and also the very, very heavy bull cult happening in Minoa and bull iconography spread all throughout Greece, which may be something. It may also just be a very trendy thing because everybody else is putting bulls on everything. So why not? It's the cool, it's the hip thing to do. Um, yeah, the last thing I want to talk about is that when we get into the transitionary period from Urnfield to Hallstatt, it's a big change. So about 100 years after Urnfield has started and then Hallstatt is springing up, that's when there is a huge shift all over Europe. We are, of course, talking about the Bronze Age collapse, which happens right then. You have the fall of the Hittite Empire, which is a huge Middle Eastern, Indo-European language-speaking empire, and the Hittites fall. You also have um, a lot of other Mediterranean groups that are experiencing massive, massive raids and economic crises from what a lot of people term the sea people. And there used to be a very popular and very trendy idea that the sea people were actually the Celts or the Proto Celts, all of those other people groups that had yet to develop. And a big reason for this is because, again, that sudden development from Urnfield into Hallstatt, that explosion of finer material things. A lot of people loved to equate that to an influx of wealth. And also in some of the Egyptian depictions of the sea peoples, they are seen again in those bird headed ships that we, of course, know from previous Bronze Ages. Nowadays, that theory isn't held very reliably. Just like the Bronze Age collapse itself. A lot of people are leaning more towards the direction that there were a series of terrible economic recessions and terrible periods of war, but that a true collapse didn't really occur. It was just a bunch of bad stuff happening, but nobody really fell apart. Nothing really vanished completely. Some places like Greece got hit a lot harder and they had to rebuild a lot. Some places like Egypt did okay. And we're also now realizing that as we're getting to Hallstatt, that the culture is not tied specifically to what we think of as a people, the modern definition. Hallstatt was a lifestyle more than anything that many people were participating in. It's very similar now to if you go to Europe, there's a European way, European life, but the French, the Germans, the Belgians, that's a very different, unique cultures with hundreds of years of different development and different situations behind them. I mean, the French and the Italians aren't the same group of people just because they both like wine and good food. And that's the same thing. What we realize now is what we've been doing is looking at the Hallstatt period as if it was one unified people group. And that's also why in academia, people are moving away from calling it Hallstatt culture and are leaning towards Hallstatt period and Hallstatt time, because now we do have the various different languages. And it's at this point that it's assumed that somewhere, the Proto-Italic people migrate down into Italy and they become, the Latins, the Umbrians, all those other people groups that populate that little boot there. And that a lot of stuff is happening. We have some migrations, but also the culture itself is just being spread. We see that with the Celtiberians and all the way down into the Pyrenees, that the dress, the fashion, the pottery is being spread, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Celts were invading everywhere because genetic evidence doesn't line up with that. So what we see now is probably a lot of what a lot of other countries are dealing with when it comes to westernization. Hollywood makes something trendy. That's the cool thing. And so a lot of other countries, specifically, in Asia or in the Baltics, they are now having their younger generations become more and more westernized as this is sort of becoming the global standard thanks to the internet and technology. And there was an equivalent of that for Hallstatt. And so, yeah, even though there used to be this very common idea of identifying Hallstatt with the Gauls, we now need to realize that Hallstatt gave birth to what the material culture we would associate with the Gauls. But yeah, that's my lead into it. I'm supposed to be a little quick, but may have been
No,
a little
that's
bit more. If you
no, that's
fall asleep,
fantastic.
if you fell asleep at this point in the podcast, Wake up. And Ardo is going to talk a little bit more about Hallstatt specifically.
Well, yeah, it's like that was all fantastic information, and actually a couple things I wanted to touch on. Uh, you talk about with the bird-headed ships. That immediately reminds me of the figures and the sculptures dedicated to Sequana, who is the goddess of the River Seine. She's riding in a boat that has a swan's head on it. That was just the first thing that kind of popped in my head when you were talking about that. Yeah, the Bronze Age collapse. I have never heard that it was the theory that it was the Celts, but you never know. And like you said, it's just we're never going to know until there's like a major archaeological find that supports that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But
Yeah, I think currently it's thought that a lot of the sea peoples wasn't one group of people. Sometimes pirates, sometimes people from faraway lands, sometimes migrants, sometimes literally the guys next door, sometimes two or three of them in the same week.
yeah,
It's just, and then crop failure and all that. But it's less one big mysterious people who wipes everybody out. I mean, sorry to
yeah.
crush everyone's Atlantis conspiracy theories, but
Yeah. I thought about making a joke about that, but yeah, the Atlantis theory. But yeah, you've said it perfectly. The Hallstatt culture is um the research I've done into it, it really does describe kind of a glamorous lifestyle, very Hollywood-esque. If you when you like, it was actually a really good analogy because like you were saying with the naming of these different cultures and time periods, a lot of the major finds for Hallstatt were in Hallstatt, Austria, which is where a large salt mine was discovered and a large graveyard over in Durenberg, where a lot of these artifacts and stuff were, thanks to the salt and the salt mines, were very well preserved. Like you had mentioned with the imagery of bulls and cattle, we see that in a vessel that was found in there. There's all sorts of pottery, leather work that's been perfectly preserved, textile fragments. There's still a wooden staircase from the salt mine that's perfectly preserved. There's a grave reconstruction. I'm just looking at a bunch of like just things on my phone during my note keeping. An axe head, a brooch, dagger, and these things look in pretty good condition considering how old they are. And
mm-hmm.
I believe it was you that sent me that article that even um, fecal matter left by the miners was perfectly preserved. So we even have an idea of what the diet of
Yeah.
those people were, which I believe was like barley and cheese. Which
Yeah, it's
um,
very fun because we see that big shift, from like I said, the culture pre the Urnfield culture. Oh, now I got to go back. We have yeah, it's tumulus, yeah. And the tumulus culture, we have the steps into agriculture, but not being large scale. And the tumulus culture um ends around 1300, and then just a couple hundred years later, we have people whose main diet now in the Hallstatt is agriculture. It's mostly cheese, which was always a staple, but now a lot of barley, a lot of grains and cereals.
yeah, exactly. And to kind of really hit on the kind of glamour of the Hallstatt culture or time period, however you want to describe it, is really by the a lot of the trading that they had that was done with the Greeks. We see a lot of importation of wine, pottery, art, which would later go on to influence Latin style material culture. Um, and like when you look at a lot of these artifacts that I'm just kind of scrolling through Google Images, like some of these wine casks and whatnot are very elaborately decorated. So it really suggests just a very kind of Hollywood-esque kind of way of living during that time period.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, like and we see like the emergence of the hill forts, the oppidums, which would be more pronounced, which would be way more popular during the later Iron Age. But yeah, that salt mine is just is it was a treasure trove of all of these artifacts, which helps gives us a better
Hmm.
idea of of the material culture, the lifestyle, a lot of the clothing and fashion that they wore then. Um, and like let's see, one of my notes here is and like it's possibly as old as the Neolithic period. So it's
Yeah, I've
just
been worked consistently. Yeah.
yeah. Um, and yeah, and it just kind of seemed to, from what I was reading, it just kind of seemed to fade out and just slowly develop into the Latin material cultures, where we see a lot of the Celtic spirals, the
Yeah.
kind of more elvish, like Lord of the Rings, elvish looking style artwork, which has got like a lot of the more organic, decoration in them, and it's uh, a lot of people seem to forget about Hallstatt, which is really one of the reasons why I really wanted to do this episode, because without Hallstatt and Urnfield, and all the other ones you described, it just all kind of flows into each other. Like these cultures didn't just flat out stop and then the next one start back up. They organically flowed into each other.
Hmm. And sometimes we also see them existing, side by side. Like I said, the Urnfield culture didn't just cease to exist. It flowed into and gave birth to Hallstatt, but people were still producing and living and using Urnfield style things, so it'd be the same as if, as there's a trend that comes up for new clothing style, but that doesn't mean that every single person's going to start wearing those. And there's entire counties and parts of countries that will stay the same way. Just like when a modern slang or vernacular enters a language, there are entire parts of the country where that's not going to happen. It doesn't
Oh yeah.
catch on.
Absolutely, and it's yeah. Looking at the United States now, like there's just like there's different the like soda and pop. It's just there's different places. Like if you say soda, they're not going to understand what you're saying, and vice versa. Like these
Exactly.
a lot of these cultures were not monolithic. Like how it was in one area, it was not the exact same how it was in the other area,
Yeah.
which is how this flow of culture and flow of uh, material goods developed, is that they influence each other, but they may not, how they were in Hallstatt did not reflect how it was further out into like Switzerland or the tribes that lived in Germany, and so on and so forth. Um, so yeah, just looking into the
Yeah.
Hallstatt was just a really cool like glimpse into that
There's
and
a
how we.
really there's a really cool map that shows it as like a color gradient, where you have the center of Hallstatt is depicted as like very, very yellow. And then as it goes out, it becomes green. And then there are some spots within the green that are very yellow because
Mhm.
there it was far more popular to live the Hallstatt, maybe they had a direct connection. We don't know. But as it faded out, it was less influence, but still belonging to the same sphere. And yeah, I mean, your analogy about talking about the soda and pop, that's it's a very good analogy. It's a micro scale, but you take that and you magnify it, and
Absolutely.
you see how different things become. It's if you think of, for example, the tumulus culture, where the proto-Scythians, proto-Italians, proto-Celts were still one people. It probably helps a lot to think of um, maybe England in the Middle Ages. Think of that as the tumulus culture, and then that over time branched out and became England today, New Zealand, America, uh, and some parts of Canada. And that way, it's not so much that, oh, Americans and New Zealanders were and Australians were the same people at some point. That's a weird way to think about it, sure, if you want to. And I think that's where our view of societies and peoples kind of falls apart, you know. And again, it's a little different because these countries have governments, which, you know, back then sometimes was the case, sometimes not. Sometimes we see really hard, very rigid, unnatural borders. And then other times it's just free flowing, which indicates that for a while there was a group of people, or just one really buff dude, I don't know, who decided that this was the end of the line. But that never lasted. And again, it would flow back and forth, which kind of leads me to my question. Because we really don't know a lot about the religion of the time period. Like we said, you know, solar motifs were still very popular. They were at an all-time popular a couple hundred years ago, if we're talking about Hallstatt, but they were still very popular. We have the moon boats, of course, we have a lot of bull stuff, but there wasn't the tendency to depict gods or spirits anthropomorphically or even in an animal style. When we later or some other time get to talking about the Chen period, a lot of the animals in there are conceived as being decorative or symbolic of their own qualities and not necessarily the representation of specific divinity. So we really don't get that until probably contact with Greece after the Mycenaean period, but specifically with contact with Rome. You know, once Rome is established. And so I guess a big question for me, though, it's a fun thing to speculate on, is what religion, what faith was like, because this is a faith podcast, right? We talk about primarily Gaulish polytheism, and I wonder what the religion of the time period was like and how much it varied. What would an individual's life look like? We have no signs of temples. You know, we have some locations that have a lot of deposits over time. Um, some people that participated in the Hallstatt culture, like the Ratian people in Switzerland, had their own cultic practices. You know, they were doing, you know, Hallstatt style things, but they had their own language and they were doing rituals in their own way using their signature, you know, fire pits. But that's a very, very niche example. We don't have very similar things. We have a bog that has a few, you know, poles with mouths and eyeballs in what would have been Hallstatt spheres of influence, but really don't know. So what do you think?
That is a great question. I actually finished a book. Here, I'm gonna reach up and grab it real quick. I was reading Joseph Campbell's Goddesses book, and actually it touches on a little bit of this because he does go over Bronze Age practices, and it's funny. I think the a lot of the bull imagery is I'm there's a no, I don't agree with Joseph Campbell on everything, but I do agree with the link between possible link between moon worship as opposed to solar worship with bulls, because he makes a good case, especially with the Mycenaean culture, this kind of linking between bull worship and the and moon worship as well.
Mm,
Um, so I'm and then we in like you know, like I said, there's this uh like this artifact of a bronze bull with that has the bull motif, yeah, bull stuff, other figures and metalworking seems to pop up during this time. Like not just in Hallstatt, there's a image here from the Czech Republic, and there's a couple other images like that. Um, so, but like going on what you were saying, how this kind of almost subtle shift from solar worship to possibly you know, moon worship with the solar wheel versus the bull imagery and the moon boats. It kind of it kind of suggests to me that they were still in very much a animistic kind of stage rather than
mm,
more Greco polytheistic, because they were trading and communicating with the Greeks. But I'm just not sure if they had established a pantheon just yet, or if they were still going the more animalistic, localized deities type of thing, or if they were just acknowledging and venerating just the spirits and not actually giving them a human shape, because that's not something we see until later on with
Mhm.
Latin. So it is a very,
Yeah.
very interesting question, and I mean, all we can do is speculate until some hard evidence pops up somewhere. But that's my opinion, is that they were probably more animistic. That's what I meant to say, not animalistic, but animistic. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's my opinion. Yeah.
That's good. And I also want to say that I don't think that moon and sun worship has to be juxtaposed or one other, because we do see a lot of imagery of bulls with yeah, the horns and the bowls. But oftentimes we see these horns, these moon boats supporting a sun, like
Mm,
especially talking again not about Hallstatt, but about the Nordic Bronze Age, um, which ran for a lot longer than its counterparts down here. But we see those boats with the solar wheel inside the boat, and that's the same with the bird-headed ships. We see those spoked wheels inside. And at this point, the wheel is, at least assumedly, still a very, very solar motif. When we get to actual Gaul with Tyrannus and his wheel, that's a whole nother bag that we, again, don't know for sure about. And there are various
yeah.
schools of thoughts. But at this time period, the wheel is very confidently, not 100%, very confidently a solar image. Even on the Nebra sky disk I mentioned earlier, which is, way, way, way back. That's Eunestus. We're talking over 4,000 years ago. Even there, we have a round sphere. And sometimes the sphere is identified as a moon, but we see the sphere, and then there's also a curve. So what that reads like a lot is a sun and a moon. And what's interesting is that there is a moon boat underneath both of those bodies that, because of the composition of that particular metal, we can tell was added far later, a couple hundred years later. So somebody had this disk for a long period of time. Then they added stars to it, and then they added a moonboat to it, to
Huh.
the sun and moon that were already there. And then they added a plaque for east and west, and then those fell off. But yeah, it's a very, very beautiful artifact. And there's some recent controversy where folks have said that it might, in fact, be an Iron Age object that just happened to be deposited with other Bronze Age things. Not so sure about that. I'm not a scholar. I don't know enough about it, but I do want to
Yeah.
put it out there in case anyone is listening to it and being like, wait a minute, that's Iron Age. Nothing
Yeah.
conclusive yet, but it is a school of thought. So it does exist, and I do want to acknowledge that.
And that's good. And yeah, it just and everyone, anyone that's listened to this for a while knows that a lot of this is speculative. We're just kind of going off the what information we have now, and just kind of building off of that.
Mm.
We're not scholars, we're not archaeologists. We're just kind of going off what
We
we've
just like it
researched.
a
Yeah, we
lot.
just like it.
But I'm kind of inclined to agree with you in that it being more animistic insofar as it's thought about, not human shaped. Because, especially we do have some very, very heavily folklorified um, versions of what we think might be Ratian mythology, which of course has experienced several layers of editions as well. So nothing's in its original form, but the stories there feature very much about supernatural beings that are more often than not depicted as animals, or at least partially animals. And so it might make sense that, since they operated within a Hallstatt um, cultural sphere, that that was that way. And we do see later on cultures like the Venetians, or the Veneti, I should say, because if I say Venetians, it can get a little tricky.
Oh
But
yeah.
the Veneti, they do start to depict some of their gods anthropomorphically, specifically Rachia, or Raitia, which is where you get the name for the Rations, because they were
Mm.
next to the Veneti, and it's assumed that it was a shared cult. But again, in her depictions, it's very strange. In some of them, she is depicted identical to a modern day painting of the Virgin Mary, a woman, a hood, and then oftentimes she's like holding a key. But then in some of them, it depicted clearly via Greek influence, like Artemis, but the big Artemis, not just Archer Artemis, the
Mm.
mother of all Artemis. Um, and in some other ones, she is depicted as a rough outline of a human being, no legs and horse heads for hands. And so
Mm.
we are in that, and this is later. This would probably be towards the end of the Hallstatt period. But we
Mm.
see kind of, that's when we see the first anthropomorphic things crop up. But even then, we have some like in between. And it's funny because in Valcamonica, which is in the Po Valley, and it's that was the intersection of a lot of like Etruscan, Racian, and Celtic stuff. The people that lived there were experiencing influences from everywhere, and there we have some of the oldest anthropomorphic dis- uh, carvings, and we know that the people that lived there, um, they did at least draw petroglyphs that were anthropomorphic, um, well into what we would call the Eunestus period. They well into that back. We don't know if there were gods or whatnot, but they did depict scenes of battle. They have a scene later on that is, concurrent with Hallstatt, that depicts um, a human body with a sun as a head. And that's also where we get that very famous rock carving of what we think is Cernunnos, because it's got the antlers, it's got the torque, and it's got the snake. And there's also a rock carving that is sometimes identified as Taranos, because it is anthropomorphic. It's holding something in one hand, and in the other hand, a club like thing, but the head is a wheel. So
Oh,
again, we
wow.
have these like step ins. So I could see where you're coming from, with first it being like, clearly a god, but the god is depicted or thought of, or at least artistically rendered as an animal or a phenomena or a symbol. And then we gradually start to see these phenomena and symbols blend with human depictions as contact with Greece and stuff increases.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. But yeah, that's definitely something to think about. And yeah, anyone listening, yeah, just if you got opinions or perspectives you would like to add, feel free to comment, let us know.
Yeah.
I think that is enough for a great episode. This was a lot of information. I absolutely love it, man. Thanks for
Yeah,
your debut as my co-host.
of course. I'm glad to be here again. Yeah. So thanks. It's a bit of an information heavy episode, but thank you for sticking through it, and at least, being here with us for the history. We do plan to get these out in at least a semi-regular fashion from now
Yeah,
on, which would be good.
and just so everyone knows, it is usually me that's pushing the episodes back. Don't, yeah, that is on me.
Yeah. Don't have a life. Don't have a life. Do this all the time. This is it. Yeah. Do you want to is there anything else you want to talk about? Anything you want to plug? Your blog, maybe?
My blog that I
Your
haven't touched.
workshop?
Uh, I'm actually working on a very large order for my carvings. My blog, I am planning on getting back to that at some point. I was planning on doing an article on a Ration deity, and then I got that. I
Just plug
think
it anyway, so when you get to it, they'll know where to find you.
very well. If you go to Helvetian Nematon at WordPress.com or Helvetian oh man, I can't remember the Gaulish name of it. But yeah, if you just look, if you type in Helvetian Nematon at WordPress.com, that'll get you there, and you'll see an older picture of my face and some And yeah, some articles that people seem to really like, and at some point I will get back and find some time to start writing articles again. But anything you got to plug in?
I have so many things that I've planned for the future, but right now I am mostly active on the Tuda Galatian Discord, but also the Galia Lichwatzis Discord. So either one of the major Gaulish Discord communities, um, they're oftentimes abbreviated to TG or GL. I am a Watis over at Tuda Galatian, which is a community service position. I just do a lot of consulting on religious or esoteric matters. And if you have any questions about cultic practices or divination or comparative mythology or anything, pop in. Uh, Find me there if you want to tag. Um, yeah, but otherwise, just enjoy your day, night, wherever you are. Have a great time, and we look forward to hearing from you. And or we look forward to you hearing us next time. We'll
uh,
work on it. We'll get it all
this,
smoothed out, baby.
oh yeah, yeah. This yeah, we're gonna try to do this once a month if we can. If I can, and then but yeah, everyone take care and have a good evening, bud.